The Gospel according to Matthew, a testimony that changed the world. Imagine, for a moment, a dimly lit room in Jerusalem nearly 2,000 years ago. A man sits at a table, quill in hand, his face tense with concentration. This man is Matthew, once a tax collector, now a disciple of Jesus. He is about to write a story that will change the course of humanity. But before diving into this fascinating story, let's pause to consider the world in which Matthew lived and wrote. It was a time of great upheaval. The Roman Empire was extending its reach over much of the known world. Ancient traditions were being questioned, and at the heart of this turmoil, a small group of people began spreading a revolutionary message. The message of a man named Jesus, whom they proclaimed as the long-awaited Messiah. Imagine the dusty streets of Jerusalem, bustling with life. Merchants shout to advertise their goods. Pilgrims flock to the temple, and Roman soldiers patrol, their armor gleaming in the sun. It was in this seething cauldron of cultures and beliefs that Christianity was born. But this world was also one of conflict. The Jews, oppressed by Roman occupation, yearned for freedom. Some awaited a political liberator who would drive out the Romans. Others sought a spiritual renewal. It was in this tense context that Jesus appeared, bringing a message that would challenge both Roman authorities and established Jewish traditions. So who was this man, Matthew, who would write one of the most influential texts in history? Imagine his life before meeting Jesus. As a tax collector, he was despised by his own people. Considered a traitor for collaborating with the Roman occupiers, he likely lived in isolation and bitterness. Then one day, everything changed. Jesus walked by his tax booth and simply said, "Follow me." 2 words that upended his life. Matthew left everything to follow this extraordinary man. From being a social outcast, he became one of the 12 apostles, a privileged witness to the life and teachings of Jesus. Can you imagine what Matthew must have felt? The rejection he had known all his life, suddenly replaced by unconditional acceptance. Loneliness transformed into fellowship with the other disciples. The greed that may have driven his life swept away by a call to a life of service and love. But why did Matthew decide to write his gospel? Let's fast forward 50 years after Jesus' death. The Christian community is growing, but it faces immense challenges. The eyewitnesses to Jesus' life are gradually disappearing. Peter and Paul have already been martyred in Rome. Stories about Jesus are multiplying, not always staying true to reality. Matthew understands the urgency of the situation. The story of Jesus, his teachings, his death, and resurrection must be recorded before memories fade. But this is no easy task. How can he capture in words the transformative experience he lived? How can he convey the power of Jesus' words, the compassion of his actions, the ultimate sacrifice of his death on the cross? Matthew's gospel is not just a simple biographical account. It is a bridge between 2 worlds. The Judaism, from which Jesus and his first disciples emerged, and the pagan world where the Christian message began to spread. Imagine Matthew sitting at his writing table, weighing each word. He knows he must convince his fellow Jews that Jesus truly is the Messiah promised by the prophets. But he also needs to explain Jewish customs to the pagans who are converting to Christianity. It is a balancing act. Task that requires both sensitivity and courage. Matthew draws on his deep knowledge of the Hebrew Scriptures. He frequently cites the Old Testament, showing how every aspect of Jesus' life fulfills an ancient prophecy. For his Jewish readers, this is powerful proof that Jesus is indeed the awaited Messiah. But Matthew goes further. He shows how Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. He presents Jesus as a new Moses, giving a new interpretation of the law on the mountain. This is a revolutionary message. Faithfulness to God is measured not by scrupulous observance of rules, but by love for God and for one's neighbor. The Gospel of Matthew is not merely a collection of anecdotes about Jesus. Its very structure tells a story. Matthew organizes his narrative around 5 major discourses of Jesus, reminiscent of the 5 books of the Torah. It is as if he is saying to his readers, here is the new Torah, the new law given by Jesus. Imagine these discourses as 5 majestic mountains rising above a plain. The most famous of them, the Sermon on the Mount, shines like a beacon of hope and challenge. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. These words have echoed through the centuries, inspiring generations of believers and even non-believers. But between these discourses, Matthew weaves a captivating narrative of Jesus' actions, miracles that defy the imagination. The blind receive sight, paralyzed walk, the dead are raised to life. Encounters that transform lives. A Samaritan woman at the well, a tax collector in a tree, a woman touching the hem of his garment in a crowd. At the heart of Matthew's gospel is a revolutionary concept, kingdom of heaven. Matthew uses this expression, rather than kingdom of God as used by the other evangelists, out of respect for Jewish sensitivity in avoiding the name of God. But this concept goes far beyond a mere question of vocabulary. Imagine for a moment what this meant for Jesus' listeners. For many, kingdom was a future hope, time when God would intervene to liberate his people and establish his rule on earth. But Jesus, as Matthew presents him, overturns this expectation. The kingdom of heaven is not just a future reality, it is a present reality, manifesting in the lives of those who follow Jesus. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, the smallest of seeds that becomes a great tree. A powerful image of how Jesus' message, starting with a small group in Galilee, would spread throughout the world. The Gospel of Matthew is not just a historical account. It is a call to transformation. Through the words and actions of Jesus, Matthew challenges his readers. Live differently. Love your enemies. Forgive without limits. Seek first the kingdom of God. Imagine the impact of these words in a society marked by violence, oppression, and revenge. Jesus calls for a revolution, not by the sword, but by love. He challenges power structures, not by overthrowing them by force, but by showing a new way of living. Matthew doesn't just report these teachings. He shows how Jesus lived them out, even to the cross, where in the face of violence and hatred, Jesus responds with forgiveness. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. These words, reported by Matthew, changed the course of history. A unique aspect of Matthew's gospel is the importance he places on the community of disciples. It is the only gospel that explicitly uses the term church, ecclesia, in Greek. Matthew does not just present Jesus as an inspiring teacher or miracle worker, but as the founder of a new community. Imagine those early Christians, often persecuted, gathering in secret to read Matthew's words. They find not only the account of Jesus' life, but also instructions on how to live in community, how to resolve conflicts, how to practice forgiveness, how to care for the most vulnerable. Matthew records Jesus' words, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them." Powerful promise for an emerging community facing hostility from the outside world. One of the most striking aspects of Matthew's gospel is its emphasis on ethics. Jesus, as Matthew presents him, does not simply call for intellectual faith or outward religious practices. He calls for a radical transformation of heart and behavior. Take the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus redefines justice, going beyond the letter of the law to reach its spirit. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. Each time Jesus deepens the ethical demand. It is not just murder that is condemned, but also anger, not just adultery, but lustful looks. Imagine the impact of these words on Jesus' listeners and on the first readers of Matthew's gospel. It is a call to total integrity, to perfect coherence between thoughts, words, and deed. But Matthew does not present this ethical call as a crushing burden. He places it in the context of God's grace. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest, says Jesus. It is an invitation to a new way of living, freed from the weight of guilt and fear. A recurring theme in Matthew's gospel is the tension between the already and the not yet kingdom of heaven. On the one hand, Jesus announces that the kingdom is already here, present in his words and actions. On the other hand, he speaks of a future judgment, of a kingdom that will come in its fullness. This tension is reflected in how Matthew presents Jesus. He is both the humble Messiah riding on a donkey and the glorious King who will return on the clouds of heaven. He is the suffering servant who gives his life on the cross and the judge of all nations at the end of time. Imagine how this message must have resonated with the early Christians, often persecuted for their faith. Matthew's gospel offered them both comfort in their present sufferings and hope for the future. The kingdom is already here, Matthew seems to say, even if you don't see it fully yet. but it will come in all its glory, patient and faithful. Although Matthew writes primarily for a Jewish audience, his gospel contains a message of universal scope. It begins with a genealogy that traces back to Abraham, the father of believers, but it ends with Jesus' command to make disciples of all nations. This was a revolutionary message. In a world divided by ethnic, cultural, and religious barriers, Jesus calls for a new community that transcends all these divisions. There is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male and female, the Apostle Paul would later write, expressing this radical vision of unity. Imagine the impact of this message in the cosmopolitan cities of the Roman Empire, where Matthew's gospel was read and shared. It was a call to a new form of community, based not on ethnicity or social status, but on a common faith in Jesus. Matthew's gospel does not present an idyllic or naive vision of Christian life. On the contrary, it highlights the cost of discipleship, challenges and sacrifices involved in following Jesus. Imagine the scene. Jesus, surrounded by his disciples, says to them, "If anyone wants to follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." These words, reported by Matthew, resonate as a challenge through the centuries. They invite us to ask ourselves, are we ready to give up everything to follow Jesus? Matthew himself embodied this message. He had left his lucrative position as a tax collector to follow an itinerant preacher. He had exchanged material security for a life of uncertainty and danger. But his writings testify to the joy and purpose he found in this new life. Through his gospel, Matthew shows us that the true treasure is not in material wealth, but in the kingdom of heaven. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, he reports Jesus' words, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. It is a call to reevaluate our priorities, to live for what truly matters. A recurring theme in Matthew's gospel is the compassion of Jesus. Matthew does not merely say that Jesus was compassionate, he shows us this compassion in action. Consider the scene where Jesus sees the crowd and is moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered, like sheep without a shepherd. This powerful image reveals Jesus' heart for the lost and the broken. But Jesus' compassion is not limited to a feeling. It translates into action. We see him healing the sick, feeding the hungry, touching the untouchables. Matthew shows us a Jesus who does not hesitate to reach out to those whom society rejects, the lepers, the demon-possessed, outcasts. In doing so, Jesus challenges his disciples, and us. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful, Matthew reports. It is a call to active compassion, not content with sympathizing from a distance, but engaging concretely with those who suffer. Matthew's gospel does not shy away from the tensions and conflicts that marked Jesus' ministry, particularly with the religious authorities of his time. Imagine the scene in the Temple of Jerusalem. Jesus, outraged by the corruption and exploitation he sees, overturns the tables of the money changers. "My house shall be called a house of prayer," he cries, "but you have made it a den of thieves." It is a moment of direct confrontation with the religious establishment. Matthew shows us a Jesus who does not hesitate to challenge narrow interpretations of the law, denounce hypocrisy, question traditions that have lost their meaning. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! This series of reproaches, reported by Matthew, shows a Jesus passionate about truth and justice, even in the face of opposition. But this conflict is not gratuitous. Matthew shows how it inexorably leads to the cross. The authorities, threatened by Jesus' message and popularity, plot to silence him. This is the beginning of the road to Calvary. Matthew's gospel reaches its climax in the account of Jesus' passion. It is here that the drama of the gospel takes on its full depth. Imagine the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus, knowing what awaits him, prays with such intensity that his sweat becomes like drops of blood. "My Father," he prays, "if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Matthew shows us here Jesus' humanity in all its vulnerability, but also his determination to fulfill God's will. Then comes the betrayal, the arrest, the unjust trial. Matthew spares us none of the details of Jesus' suffering. The mockery, the blows, the crown of thorns, and finally, the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?" This heart-wrenching cry from Jesus, reported by Matthew, echoes through the centuries as the ultimate expression of human suffering. But this is not the end of the story. Matthew's gospel does not end with Jesus' death. It culminates in the staggering account of the resurrection. Imagine the dawn of that first day of the week. The women, hearts heavy, go to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, but they find the tomb empty. An angel announces to them the incredible news. He is not here, he has risen, just as he said. Matthew takes us through the disciples' disbelief, fear, and then immense joy when they realize that Jesus is truly alive. It is more than just a return to life. It is the beginning of a new era, the definitive victory over death and sin. And it is in this context that Matthew records Jesus' final words to his disciples. Go and make disciples of all nations. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. It is both a mission and a promise. A mission that will transform the world. A promise that will sustain the church through the centuries. The Gospel of Matthew, this account written nearly 2,000 years ago, continues to exert a profound influence on our world. Consider for a moment the impact of its teaching. Beatitudes have inspired movements for social justice through the century. Call to love one's enemies motivated figures like Martin Luther King Jr. in their nonviolent struggle for civil rights. Jesus' concern for the marginalized continues to inspire countless charitable works around the world. But beyond its social impact, the Gospel of Matthew continues to transform individual lives. It invites us to a personal encounter with Jesus, to discover in him not only a great teacher or moral model, the Son of God who offers forgiveness, healing, and a new life. In conclusion, the Gospel of Matthew is not just a historical account. It is a call to decision. Through its pages, Jesus challenges us. Who do you say I am? This is the central question of the Gospel, a question that demands a response from each of us. Matthew presents us with a Jesus who leaves no one indifferent. He provokes, he challenges, he comforts, he heals. He calls for a radical transformation, a new way of seeing God, others, and ourselves. As we prepare to delve deeper into the text of Matthew in the following sessions, let us keep in mind the invitation he extends to us. An invitation to discover Jesus, follow him, to enter into the adventure of the kingdom of heaven. An invitation that, 2,000 years after Matthew laid down his pen, continues to resonate, undiminished power.